Hi everybody, we're here in El Paso, Texas, and we've got a great guest today, Diana Natalicio, President of the University of Texas at El Paso. And we're bringing you issues that are going to be very important in the state capitol coming up here in January in the next session of the legislature. Diana, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here.
You know, we've talked about your story. I think all El Paso knows your story at UTEP and the good work that you've been doing there for all these years. But let's talk about how you got into education. Your early education, where it was, your college education, and how was it that you decided to actually get into education as a career?
Well, I actually started my education in St. Louis, where I grew up. I had a very good elementary school education and a mediocre high school education. I went to a public high school for kind of lower middle class kids, and there were very low expectations of us in high school. And so I finished high school like most of my friends, ready to go out into the workforce. And my first experience after high school was a job as a secretary and a receptionist, telephone operator, at a large manufacturing company in St. Louis. And I operated that switchboard. I was the Lily Tomlin of Nordberg Manufacturing. And I operated that switchboard for about 3 months probably when I had mastered the entire concept of switchboards, and I found it really boring, and I was quite afraid that my life was going to follow this tedious path. And so I began to think about other things, and nobody in high school ever talked to us about college or scholarships or SATs or anything related to that. And so I went to St. Louis University one day and asked if I could enroll. I hadn't applied, I hadn't done anything. And thankfully, the Jesuits at St. Louis University kind of took me under their wing and said, if you really want to go to school, you're going to have to work hard because we don't think you're very well prepared, but, we'll take a chance if you're willing to take a chance and work hard. So I did, basically. And St. Louis University just turned my life around, totally turned my life around. And, they set very, very high standards, but they also provided a tremendous amount of support for people like me. I was competing with boys who had gone to St. Louis University prep school, and they had read Dante and all these important works, and I didn't even know what any of that was. I mean, I was really not well prepared. So when I finished St. Louis University, my life had charted in a new direction, and so I was off to Brazil on a Fulbright, and I did a whole bunch of things that opened up a whole world to me. And I decided that I wanted to be a part of creating opportunities for others that had been created for me, because education is really what changed my life. And so El Paso was the perfect place for me. The teaching position, a temporary teaching job, a 1-year temporary visiting assistant professor position. But in the process, as soon as I got here, I began to feel an affinity for the place. I liked the idea of being on the border. I liked the desert. I liked a lot of things, but most of all, I liked the mission of the institution. I liked the students. I could see that they were hardworking, they were earnest, but many of them weren't very well prepared. And so it was kind of the opportunity that I had been preparing for, perfect fit. And so here I am, 37 years later, kind of acting on what had been my motivation in getting an education.
Well, let me follow up with 2 questions. First, how did you finance your education there in St. Louis? I think that's relevant for every family today. And second, what about linguistics? How did you come to Spanish?
Well, I financed my education actually by working half-time as a secretary. I did have the typing and shorthand skills from high school. That's what I was in the vocational program. Everybody was in a vocational program. I mean, that's what they did. The boys took shop and auto mechanics and the rest of that, and the girls took typing and shorthand and home economics and so on. And so I was able to finance my education. In those days, even a private university like St. Louis University wasn't that expensive. It was, I believe, $300 a semester. Now, this was in the 60s. It was in the late 50s, early 60s, so it's a long time ago. But I worked half-time, and I didn't do much else except go to school, go to work, and do homework, because I had to study really hard, compared to what I had done in high school. I mean, I was working constantly. Every weekend I did nothing but study. So I worked my way through school. I did have a place to live. My parents had a nice little house, and I had a room, and I had a place to study, and so on. So my life was in some ways a cakewalk compared to what I see some of our students confronting today. But in a lot of other ways, it was very hard because I had almost no social life. I had very little. I didn't belong to organizations or clubs or anything because I was working all the time. Spanish is kind of just one of these things that happens with a good teacher, and you take a class and you're pretty good at it, and then you like the teacher, and so you take another class, and pretty soon you're majoring in it. And the Spanish faculty at St. Louis University was particularly good. They were kind of a crazy bunch of Spaniards and people from Latin America, a lot of Jesuits, and they were just enormously brilliant and entertaining, and just created a life in Spanish that I had never understood before I got to know them, that you could have a different life in a second language, kind of a different culture and a different life. And that's what they brought to it. And I found that fascinating. And so my love of languages then kind of emerged from that set of relationships with teachers. And when I went to Brazil, then I learned Portuguese. I thought I knew Portuguese before I went to Brazil because I had a Spanish teacher who taught a Portuguese class, but I learned later that his Portuguese was somewhat affected by his Spanish. And so I learned Portuguese really well in Brazil. And then I was recruited back to UT Austin as a teaching assistant, and I did a master's degree in Portuguese at UT Austin. And that's how I became a Texan, basically.
Let's segue to higher education. When you look at Texas and take a step back. And when I first got to the legislature, I think there was some seminal work done, some great work done by a fellow named Don Brown, Higher Education Coordinating Board chief, did a lot of work when you and I were working on higher education issues back in the 1997, 1999 era. And I think he set out a very lofty goal, worked with the governor at the time and others, to say we've got to graduate this many students for Texas to succeed. If we're going to be competitive as a nation state, Texas is the 9th largest nation in the world if we looked at an economy, then we're going to need to graduate many more students, and we're going to need to get them there with this target. And so this initiative was called Closing the Gap. They laid out 630 as the magic number. 630,000 kids over a period of time are going to need to get a college education. And let's now look at what the challenges are and where the demographic of that initiative has to succeed, and it has to succeed in El Paso, Texas. We are the harbinger of the future. We are the case study of what has to work in higher education. So as we look at that goal, as we say, here's where we are with Closing the Gap, and we look at higher education in the state of Texas, articulate, if you will, in your words, what the challenges are and how we're doing in meeting those challenges.
Well, I think the biggest challenge for all of us working in higher ed today is the tension between access and excellence or quality. Trying to make it work, affordability and excellence. How do you provide both access, which is something that UTEP has been totally committed to because this is an undereducated region, and we are the major provider, and it's incumbent upon us to ensure that young people with talent and motivation have opportunities to get a higher education degree. And so we work very hard on creating access through affordability and through flexible class scheduling and a lot of other things that we do to make the university a welcoming place. But at the same time, we have to provide quality and excellence because our students have every right to expect the same quality education that they'd get if they went off to a highly affluent university out of the city. With their talent and their motivation, they have a right to a quality higher education. So access without quality or excellence is really an empty invitation, and we shouldn't do that to young people. We ought to give them all the tools they need so when they graduate with a diploma from UTEP, they'll go out and they'll be able to compete with anybody from anywhere. And I'm confident UTEP students will be able to do that as long as we provide them with that quality, because they have the ganas, they have the desire to succeed, they really do. And they're hungry for the kinds of opportunities that a lot of other students take for granted. So if we can give them that quality, we will succeed in creating a pathway for them to a successful life. That's a wonderfully exciting mission. But those tensions, and it's about money. It's all about money. You know, people say money doesn't solve problems. Well, it actually is the key issue right now, because there are two sources of revenue, as you know, Senator. One is state appropriations, and the other is tuition and fees. And when one goes down, the other one has to go up, because in order to provide that quality, we have to get the resources from somewhere. And so our challenge every day that we think about this is, how can we provide that quality without raising the price? And you know, our tuition now is $1,000 a semester lower than San Antonio and Arlington, $2,000 a semester lower than Dallas or Austin. I mean, we're trying to offer our students quality at an affordable price, and it's really hard to manage those tensions.
I want to get into that, because I completely agree with the statements that you've made, and I want to talk about the state of Texas and what a state role should be, and what we ought to be doing in areas of financing college educations with programs like Texas Grants. And then on the other side, having general revenue appropriations to support the functions of the university so that you can depend on a flow of money over time coming day in, day out. From the 60s, when I think we had the only education governor that I can remember, which is John Connally, he put higher education on the map in Texas. He said, we're going to make strong advancements in these areas and try and create opportunities. I think really he was reacting to California, because California and Texas were in somewhat of a competition at that post-war era. Jumpstart 40 years in the future, we're still in that competition with Florida, with California. And you look at California's place in the world map in higher education excellence, and particularly Tier 1, we'll talk about that in a minute. There's been a flow of funds into higher education in certain states that we don't see in Texas. And can you comment on the declining share of state money that goes in to support your budget? If you look at your budget as here's 100, and you used to rely on so many cents coming in from the state, and you'd make up the rest elsewhere, that's been a declining share over time. How has it affected you, and what's the nature of that declining support from the state?
Well, indeed, the state appropriations have declined. If you look at the enrollment growth, we have today $1,000 less per student per year in state appropriations than we had 5 years ago. So $1,000 less per student per year in state appropriations. How do we deal with that? What do we do with that? Well, what we do is we raise tuition. But at UTEP, we do that much more gingerly than it would occur at, say, UT Dallas or UT Austin, where they can raise tuition much more aggressively, and have, because they have a different demographic. And so the result of that is that we're competing with them for faculty. If we're out in the marketplace trying to hire a new faculty member in engineering, we're going to be competing not only with UT Dallas, but with California schools and with private schools throughout the country and so on. And I don't know very many faculty candidates who come in and say, I'll take $50,000 less a year in salary because I know you're serving a student body that's challenged by the cost of higher education. I mean, it's just not real to think about it that way. And so we have to pay a competing salary in order to get the quality faculty that are going to allow our students to develop in the ways that all of us want. And so the tension around kind of a static and declining state appropriation and ever increasing tuition has raised a lot of issues throughout the state. I understand that parents are concerned. I understand that our students, most of whom pay their own tuition through their employment and so on, I understand that everybody's concerned about that rising cost. But there are certain quality trade-offs that you can't make. And so that's where I think Texas has really gotten behind states like California, where clearly they're on the world-class map, and Texas just hasn't been able to do that, or willing.
There's another side of college affordability too when you're looking at the state, and that's Texas Grants.
Right.
It's the ability of a student to sit down and say, okay, here's how I'm going to finance my college education. My family and I are going to sit down and work out what can we pay in tuition, what's going to come in grants, what are we willing to borrow, which usually is not much given where the economy is, and then what can we do for work-study programs, and where can we go have a job, during our college degree so that we can afford to pay for college. And I think one of the issues that's not talked about nearly enough is Texas grants. In the 90s, Georgia made a program, made a state goal. If you have a B, you're going to go to college and you're going to get through college for free. And we're going to make sure that we get you out in 4 years. You're going to be in the workplace because we're going to support you. We're going to get the kinds of money to support your college degree because it's going to pay back in your productivity in the workplace. When you look at Texas grants, for example, how are we doing at the state level? What's the state doing to really support the need in Texas grants?
Well, this is an area that has been very, very frustrating because Texas grants, as you recall, were announced with sort of a grand excitement about how we were going to encourage students on the Georgia model, very similar. The idea that there was a promise made to many students, and we ourselves went out into the community and talked to students about the fact that if they had a B average and if they were doing what they needed to do and had financial need, that the Texas grant would cover the cost of higher education. Well, either somebody didn't do the calculation properly at the beginning and understood or failed to understand what it was going to cost to fund a program like Texas grants, or it was simply an empty promise, but the result was that it was underfunded right from the start, and the funding has since declined. And so now students who should be receiving Texas grants, who qualify in every sense under the current criteria, don't get them. At UTEP, what we did was to establish something called a UTEP grant, which was $1,000 a semester. It's not a lot, but it was something that we tried to do to at least reward students somehow for the fact that they've complied with all of the criteria for a Texas grant. So Texas grants now are being proposed as the criteria for Texas grants are being proposed for change because there's not enough funding to allow all the students who are currently eligible to enroll in that program or to receive funding. And so now we're going to change the criteria, or at least that's what's being proposed. And under the new criteria, about a third of the students who currently qualify at UTEP for Texas grants would be eliminated because they wouldn't be eligible. And that's very worrisome because money does make a difference. I mean, you're absolutely right. Our students put together financial aid packages that include everything you can think of. I mean, they work on campus, they get a small loan, they get financial aids. Many of them are eligible for Pell Grants. So, we put together these packages, and they're quite vulnerable because our students are also not very resilient with such things as someone in the family becoming ill and no health insurance and just all of the complications of being poor. I mean, being poor is difficult in our society, very difficult because there are no options. And so education then becomes the thing that's sacrificed in someone's life. And it's that long-term consequence that they can't really prepare for because they've got to take the short-term decision to drop out of school. That's always the worst news that we get, is when a student with talent and motivation says, I've got to drop out of school because somebody's ill and I've got to take another job. I've got to work a second job. It's heartbreaking, but I'm very worried about Texas grants, and I hope that in the next session of the legislature these new criteria are not accepted, not approved, because I think it would really, really hurt the poorest of our students, those who have the greatest need.
I think those of us who believe that we need to take tuition, rein it in, lower the cost of education, have to have the courage to say on the other side, where's the money going to come from?
Exactly.
And where's the money going to come from in general revenue, flows to the university that you can count on, that you can go hire someone and say, this money's going to be here year in, year out, and it's going to cover the inflation costs of running this university. And then the second thing that we absolutely need to do is to get in the middle of the real issues of financing a college education and increase the amount of money for Texas grants. I think there's many of us in the Senate, 16, 18, that will vote for that and that will do that, and it's the revenue side that's the issue. If people are not willing to talk about what are we going to do to raise the revenues with the word taxes and how we're going to make that happen so that kids can get a college education and graduate on time, then we're not going to get it done. And the alternative is tuition hikes, and I think that's the reality, as you've articulated. Let's shift if we can. My dad was a student at the Texas College of Mines in the 40s, was there as working with a lot of folks that were playing basketball at the time. He was not on the basketball team, but helped do a lot of stuff around the basketball team, was with the football team, went out and got a great job after UTEP working in the cotton industry back then. And El Paso was a very different place then. The campus, if you look at the maps of the 4 or 5 buildings that were in existence back then in the mid-40s, and you've seen UTEP just grow to meet the needs of a growing city. Let's talk about this session and what the priorities are for this session. We're moving into a real key session, and the word on everyone's mind, the theme on everyone's mind is Tier 1. What is Tier 1 and how does it affect UTEP?
Well, Tier 1 is a kind of concept of research universities, first-class universities, top-tier universities. Some people call them national research universities. And there is no real designation of Tier 1. I mean, there's nobody who has a kind of book and says, all right, now you're in Tier 1. But the common definition is that you do about $100 million a year in annual research expenditures. That's roughly the threshold for being a Tier 1 university. We're at 50 million. And we've moved from 3 million in 1988 to 50 million, so there's no reason in the world why we can't move to 100 million at UTEP. I mean, that's something that we can certainly aspire to with I think, quite a lot of confidence. So Texas has 2 Tier 1 universities, public universities, UT Austin and Texas A&M. California has 9. We talked about California earlier. California has developed its University of California system so that 9 of its universities are in that top tier, regarded nationally as national research universities or Tier 1 universities. They all do more than $100 million, those 9. In Texas, we have only 2 that do more than $100 million a year, and that's Austin and A&M.
And barely.
And barely.
At that.
Right.
49
right,
and 50 in the top 50, right?
Right, exactly. So we believe, many of us believe, that Texas, in order to be competitive in the global economy, Texas has got to have more top-tier universities or national research universities. And a designation of 7 institutions in Texas, including UTEP, was made last year of emerging Tier 1 universities. UTEP is one of those 7.
Let's go through the 7.
All right.
So
there are 4 in the UT system: Arlington, Dallas, San Antonio, and El Paso. And there's North Texas, there's Houston, and there's Texas Tech. All right, so there's the 7. And so the 7 of us are institutions that are at various stages of development of our research agenda and so on. There is some sense that during this session of the legislature, there's going to be some activity relating to providing some kind of special funding to accelerate the development of these emerging Tier 1 universities toward their goal of becoming top tier or Tier 1. Our position has been that what ought to happen is we ought to be allowed to compete for this, all of the 7. And that there ought to be some kind of matching program where if we earn federal research dollars, for example, those federal research dollars are matched by state funding so that we accelerate, we double our money, if you will. And if we get some major philanthropic contribution toward research development, that would be matched. And so there would be a way that the state could incent our development as a research university, or the other 6 as well. There are others who believe that there's not enough money to incent all of us, and so we ought to designate a priori a couple of institutions and build them, and then we'll go on to the others. I'm very much opposed to that, and I think most of us in the group of 7 are opposed to that, because if you declare on some political grounds or whatever criterion you use that, say, 2 of the 7 are going to be invested in and the rest are not, you're sending a signal that you've got 5 losers and 2 winners. That's not a very smart way to incent people, because you're going to incent 2, but you're going to disincent 5. So it seems to me that we ought to be trying to encourage. Texas is a big enough state that we can have 7 more Tier 1s, and we're not all going to get there at the same speed, right? Some of us are going to be there in 5 years, some of us are going to be there in 10 years. And I think if the state incents the acceleration, those who are most competitive are going to be most successful. And I think UTEP is a pretty competitive institution these days, and I think we're confident that if there's a fair competition, if there's an even playing field, we'll be there. I mean, we'll be able to get considerable state support. This is really important not only because Texas needs more research universities in order to compete globally, but we hear about the top 10% rule in Texas and how absolutely controversial that's become because UT Austin feels this enrollment pressure from the top 10% rule. Well, it's all connected, really. The enrollment pressure at Austin and A&M is a direct function of the perception of young people in Texas that the only quality universities in the state are Texas A&M and UT Austin. In other words, we've created this hierarchy of institutions where we've got this sense that the top tier universities are the only ones that top 10% students ought to aspire to. So there's huge enrollment pressure there. In fact, if we had 9 top tier universities, just as California does, what would happen in Texas is exactly what happens in California. People choose universities based on specific programs, physics in Santa Barbara, or biotech in San Diego, or agriculture in Davis, or whatever it might be. So it's all connected in so many ways. You know, top tier universities are better for undergraduate students too, because it gets to that issue of quality that I talked about earlier. Having a research program on a campus, an exciting, cutting-edge research program, creates opportunities for undergraduate students. And you know, last year our grants created 1,100 jobs, more than that, I guess now, 1,150 or something, jobs on campus in research labs through grants for undergraduate students. I mean, that's an enormous contribution to their education.
I want to emphasize this point because I think our listeners, this is maybe the most important, one or two most important things that we're going to be going for this session. And that is to make sure that UTEP is right there at the starting line on the race for excellence, the race for Tier 1. And the one approach is we're going to designate the winners. The race is over because we're just saying who's going to win. The other approach is line everybody up, let them get in the race, let them go for federal research dollars, let those dollars and philanthropic dollars be matched, and who wins, wins. And we're not going to just say you are the winner before the race has started. And I think it's very important that be stressed as one of the major goals for El Paso going into this session. When you travel the world and you look at what's changing very rapidly in front of us is the nature of jobs. And jobs are related to knowledge, and knowledge is related to who has the research, who has the capability. And increasingly what I see are these regional economic alliances. And at the center of those economic alliances is a great university. You have to have the university in the middle of your economic endeavors, or as a region you don't succeed. And so this becomes the most important thing for El Paso's future. Whatever we're doing at Fort Bliss with future combat systems, whatever we're doing with medicine, whatever we're doing with dynamic new ways of doing business in the new world, whatever we're doing with great engineering, construction, IT, the things that UTEP's been doing, it is vitally important that we emerge from this race in the next 10 to 20 years as one of these universities. And I think when you stress Tier 1, I want to echo what you're saying, because all of us should be saying the same thing. UTEP needs to be in the race, and we as a community need to make this a priority.
Well, that's absolutely right. Every major metropolitan area that's highly successful has a research university at its core. I mean, it's not only opportunities that it creates for students to come in and get an education of the highest caliber, but it also generates all of this other kind of startup companies and technology transfer and commercialization. I mean, it serves as a catalyst for economic development, and in the future, that's going to be even more critical than it is now.
When you go to a place like China, and you see that the Chinese government 8-10 years ago said, we're going to create 100 world-class universities because we need them to compete. And hitherto they'd been sending for 40 years their best and brightest here, and had a large percent of them stay here. And then they created the dynamic for Microsoft or Google or major inventions in chemistry. And China took a look at that and said, no, wait a minute, we're sending our best and brightest, they're going to American universities, and they're becoming part of America's success. China set out a goal to do exactly what you're talking about doing here in Texas. But in China, they've taken a lead to say, we're going to put the public resources into this public good to make it happen. I think when we look at the world, it's changed. And we have to compete and get up to compete. And I think this discussion, this conversation we're having on Tier 1, we're going to have throughout the session. I hope to get you on the Senate floor, and we'll do another one of these shows maybe in March to talk about where are we in this race and how's this going. But I want
I
El
hope we'll
Pasoans.
both be smiling.
I hope we're smiling, and I'm confident we're smiling, because the argument is too strong to say otherwise. You can't just say we're going to designate these two, regardless of their talent, regardless of their ability to get there, and we're going to exclude the other 5. It just can't work that way. And I hope that El Pasoans listening to this take up the cause, start talking about this more and more, because I think it's important.
It is absolutely critical. We've worked very hard at UTEP, and we've had some great investments by the UT System Permanent University Fund and by the Texas Legislature in facilities and laboratories and that sort of thing. We've all worked hard to build gradually to the point that UTEP is a contender, and a very serious contender. We are not at the bottom of the 7 by far. In federal funding, we're ranked 4th in Texas. And so first Texas A&M, UT Austin, then University of Houston, and then UTEP. So we're right in the mix. We're very, very competitive. And so for any designation to be made that would leave us out would be, I think, a huge mistake. The other point that I think is very critical here is that we are educating a 21st century demographic at UTEP. And that is going to be the key to Texas' future. It's going to be the research universities and the 21st century demographic. The fastest growing segment of the state's population has to be a part of this state's transformation. Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank you for being on the show. We could talk another 2 hours about these topics. We're going to do this again in March, probably down in Austin, and focus on the Senate floor and talk about this very issue. I want to thank you for being part of the show today. Please write your check to the UTEP Endowment Fund. That's a part of what we're trying to get done. If we all join and do our little part, then UTEP can grow the endowment, which will be matched in research dollars. It's a very critical part of attracting the kind of talent that we're going to need to really compete for Tier 1. So until we meet again on the Senate floor, I want to thank you for joining us, and please join us as we explore these issues going forward in Austin. The next shows will be from the Senate floor in Austin, Texas. Thank you for being with us.